The fifth time my daughter's boyfriend asked about the property, I stopped answering. Not rudely. I just said, "Oh, you know how it is," and changed the subject. But I noticed, when you spend 32 years as a structural engineer, you learn to spot the thing that doesn't belong. A hairline crack in a foundation that looks solid, a beam that's slightly off-center. Everything looks fine until you know what to look for. His name was Connor Whitfield. He had good teeth and a firm handshake, and he always looked me straight in the eye when he talked to me, which I used to think was a sign of honesty. Now, I think some people just practice that. My daughter Sophie had met him at a fundraiser in Portland about 8 months before she brought him home to meet me. She was 31, a speech therapist at a pediatric clinic, and she had her mother's way of laughing, head tilted back, completely unguarded. The first time I saw her with Connor, she laughed like that 3 times in 1 hour. I wanted to like him for that reason alone. I am 64 years old. I live alone in the house my wife Helen and I built together outside Bend, Oregon. 4 acres, a shop where I restore old furniture, a garden that I let go too wild every summer, and then spend October apologizing to. Helen passed away from a stroke 6 years ago. It's still her house in every room that matters. Connor was 36. He said he worked in private equity consulting, helping small regional businesses restructure their finances and attract investment. He had a business card with a clean, minimalist design and a San Francisco address. He drove a leased BMW and wore a watch that cost more than my first car. The first time he asked about the property, we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. He said, "This is a beautiful spread, Frank. How many acres did you say?" I told him 4. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're converting something in their head. "Prime Deschutes County land," he said. "You have any idea what the per-acre value is up here these days?" I said I had a rough idea. The second time was Thanksgiving. He asked whether I'd ever looked into a conservation easement for the back portion of the property, said there were significant tax advantages for landowners willing to work with certain investment structures. I said I wasn't really looking to do anything with the land. The third time, he asked whether I had a financial advisor. The fourth time, he asked, very casually, while we were washing dishes, whether Sophie and I were close, financially speaking. Did we talk openly about money? I said we did. That was the one that made me put down the dish towel and go outside to the shop for a while. Not because I was angry, I was something else. Something quieter and colder than anger. I didn't say anything to Sophie at first. She and Connor had been together 8 months by then. She glowed around him in a way I hadn't seen in years, and I knew from experience that a father who raises concerns too early only teaches his daughter to defend the man instead of see him clearly. So I waited. I watched. What I saw was this. Connor was never cruel to Sophie. He was attentive, complimentary, physically affectionate in a way that seemed genuine. He brought her flowers for no reason. He remembered small details she'd mentioned weeks earlier. He was, in every visible way, the right kind of man. But there were things Sophie didn't see, because she wasn't looking from my angle. He never talked about his own family. When Sophie mentioned her late mother, Connor would nod sympathetically and redirect the conversation within 30 seconds. He talked about money the way most people talk about weather, constantly, casually, as if it were the basic atmosphere of all conversation. And every time we were together, he found a way to ask about the land, the house, my retirement, my plans. I am not a wealthy man by any grand measure, but the house is paid off. I have a pension from the engineering firm and a reasonable amount put away. The property alone, given what land has done in Central Oregon over the past decade, is worth something substantial. I don't think about it much. It never seemed relevant until Connor started making it feel relevant. In February, Sophie called to tell me Connor had proposed. She was crying, the good kind, breathless and overwhelmed. I told her I was happy for her, and I was, in the part of me that wanted more than anything to be wrong about him. But I wasn't wrong. I knew I wasn't wrong. The wedding was set for September, which gave me 7 months. I spent the first 2 of those months trying to talk myself out of what I was thinking. I told myself I was a 63-year-old widower who was too protective, of his only daughter. I told myself that asking about finances didn't make someone a criminal. I told myself that Connor's watch and his business card and his San Francisco address were not evidence of anything except success. Then in April, I called a man named Dwight Sauer. Dwight had done investigative work for our engineering firm years ago, background checks on contractors, a few cases involving fraudulent billing. He was retired now mostly, but he still took occasional work for people he trusted. I had referred him business twice over the years. He owed me a favor, though he'd never say it that way. I drove down to meet him at a diner outside Redmond. I told him everything I'd observed. He listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people lose somewhere around age 30. When I was done, he said, "What do you want to know?" I said, "I want to know if he's who he says he is." Dwight called me 3 weeks later. Connor Whitfield had a real name, Connor Whitfield. That part was accurate. But the private equity consulting was a one-man operation with no verifiable clients, registered to a mail forwarding address in San Francisco. He had a business degree from a mid-tier school in Arizona and a history of short-term financial relationships with women who own property. Dwight had found 2 of them. The first was a woman in Scottsdale who had met Connor at a charity event 4 years ago. They dated for 11 months. During that time, he had convinced her to put money into a private investment vehicle he managed. She lost $40,000. She had not pressed charges because she was embarrassed and because Connor had structured things in a way that made it difficult to prove intent. The second was a woman in Sacramento. 18 months of dating. He had her co-sign on a loan for a business venture. The business was real, but the numbers were fabricated. She was still dealing with the credit consequences. Neither of these women knew about the other. Neither of them knew about Sophie. I sat with that information for a long time. I sat with it in the shop, sanding a drop-leaf table I was restoring for a neighbor, and I thought about how to handle it without destroying my daughter. My first instinct was to go straight to Sophie. Sit her down, show her what Dwight had found, let her make the decision. But I knew Sophie. She had her mother's stubbornness alongside her mother's warmth, and she had already once, years ago, stopped speaking to me for 2 months because I'd expressed concerns about a different boyfriend. When Sophie decided she loved someone, evidence to the contrary felt like an attack. She would hear my concerns and interpret them as jealousy, overprotection, a father who couldn't let go. So I did something that cost me more than I expected. I called Connor directly. I asked him to meet me for coffee in Bend on a Tuesday afternoon in May. I told him I wanted to talk, father to future son-in-law, about a few things. He agreed, pleasantly, no hesitation. We sat at a table near the window at a cafe downtown. He ordered an Americano. I ordered nothing. He smiled the whole time, that easy, practiced smile that had probably served him well for years. I told him I knew about Scottsdale. I told him I knew about Sacramento. He didn't flinch. He barely paused. He said those situations had been misunderstandings, that both women had entered into financial arrangements voluntarily, that he had documentation showing his good faith. He said he was sorry I'd been misinformed. He said he loved my daughter. He was very calm. That was the most alarming thing. A guilty man with nothing to hide doesn't sit that still. I told him that if he went through with the wedding, I would make sure Sophie had all the information I had. I told him I had copies of everything. I told him I wasn't angry. I wasn't threatening him. I was simply being transparent. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Frank, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'd really like the chance to show you who I am." I drove home and called Dwight. I said, "He's not going to stop." Dwight said, "No, they never do." The months between May and September were the longest I've spent since Helen died. Connor and Sophie got more serious, not less. He moved into her apartment in Portland. She started talking about finances openly. They were combining things, she said, building towards something. She sounded happy. She sounded certain. I tried once more in July. I asked Sophie to come for the weekend, just the 2 of us. Said I wanted to talk before the wedding. She came on a Saturday. I made the brisket she grew up eating. After dinner I said I needed to show her something, and I put the folder on the table, Dwight's report, printed and organized, the names of the women in Scottsdale and Sacramento, the financial filings, all of it. Sophie looked at it for a long time. She went quiet in a way that wasn't calm. It was the quiet before something breaks. Then she said, "Dad, why are you doing this?" It wasn't a question. I said, "Because I need you to know." She said she knew Connor. She said he had explained those situations to her already. Yes, he had told her. He'd been honest. There had been difficulties with past investors who had unrealistic expectations. She said she trusted him. She said, and this part I'll carry for a long time, she said, Mom would have trusted my judgment. I didn't say anything to that. I couldn't. She drove back to Portland that night. We didn't speak for 3 weeks. The wedding was September 14th. It was an outdoor ceremony at a vineyard outside McMinnville. About 200 people. Sophie's friends from college and work, Connor's people. A scattering of family. I had been told I would walk her down the aisle. I had not been told much else. I showed up. What else would I do? I had called Dwight the week before and asked him to make sure everything was in order. He had. The 2 women, Brenda from Scottsdale and a woman named Layla from Sacramento, had both agreed, after much persuasion and some legal consultation, to provide written statements. One had agreed to be present. Layla drove up from Sacramento. She sat in the back row in a gray dress and she didn't speak to anyone. I had also, based on Dwight's recommendation, contacted the Yamhill County Sheriff's Office with the documentation. There was a detective there, a quiet, thorough woman named Detette Calloway, who had found, through channels I wasn't privy to, 2 additional complaints against Connor in other states that had never been formalized. She was not at the ceremony. But she was nearby. I walked Sophie down the aisle on a warm September afternoon, with the Willamette Valley spread out below the vineyard in every direction, and I don't think I have ever been more aware of how beautiful my daughter is, or how much she looks like her mother. At the altar, the officiant began. Readings, vows, the whole warm ritual of it. I stood in the front row with Sophie's aunt Connor's side arrayed opposite us, everything exactly as it should look. And then, about 12 minutes into the ceremony, Sophie did something. She reached into her bouquet. I had noticed earlier that her bouquet seemed slightly bulkier than expected. I had not thought about it. Now she drew out a small folded piece of paper, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she turned, and she handed it to me. I opened it. It said, "Dad. I found the emails. You were right. I'm so sorry. Help me." My hands didn't shake. I had spent 7 months arriving at this moment, and I was not going to shake now. I looked at Sophie. She was looking straight ahead, jaw set, eyes dry. She had her mother's composure. She also had, I realized, her mother's intelligence, and she had put that paper in her bouquet before the ceremony began, which meant she had known, had planned for this, had decided she would do it this way rather than in private. I don't know exactly why. I think she needed witnesses. I turned to the aisle. I said, "I'm sorry. I need a moment." People assumed it was emotion. Someone near the back laughed softly. I walked to the end of the row. Dwight was standing just outside the vineyard's gate area, where we had agreed he would be. I handed him the note. He took out his phone. 2 minutes later, Detette Calloway came through the gate. I won't describe everything that happened next in detail because some of it belongs to Sophie and not to me. There was a conversation at the side of the venue. There was a period of confusion among the guests. Connor was calm, and then he was not calm, and then he was being escorted away from the vineyard by people who were not guests. The ceremony did not continue. Sophie sat with me on a low stone wall near the parking area, while everything sorted itself out around us. She didn't cry. She held my hand the way she used to when she was small, and we were crossing a street together. After a while, she said, "When did you know?" I said, "April of last year." She said, "Why didn't you make me listen?" I said, "Because you had to get there yourself." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The emails were from a woman in Denver. I found them last Tuesday. He'd been seeing her the entire time we were together. She didn't know about me either." I didn't say I wasn't surprised. Later that evening, after the vineyard had cleared and Dwight had gone and the caterers had quietly and professionally handled the situation with a grace I'll always appreciate, Sophie and I drove back to Bend together. She slept most of the way. I drove through the high desert in the dark, the lava fields black on either side of the highway, the sky doing what Oregon skies do in September. I thought about Helen the way I always do on long drives. I thought about what she would have done differently, and I think the honest answer is that she would have found a way to get through to Sophie in July, at the kitchen table, over brisket. She always had better instincts for the exact right moment. I tend to be early or late, and that night I was grateful it had worked out anyway. Connor Whitfield was formally charged that fall. There was a civil case filed by Brenda in Scottsdale that finally moved forward, and the Denver woman, whose name I never learned, provided testimony that locked certain things into place. I was not involved in the legal proceedings beyond the initial statement I gave to Tynoe. Sophie took a leave from the clinic and spent 6 weeks in Bend. She helped me in the shop some mornings. She repotted all the plants on the front porch and threw out the ones that had quietly died over the summer while I wasn't paying attention. She cooked, badly, which she has always done with complete confidence, and I ate everything she made without complaint. One evening she found a photo album Helen had put together in the last year of her life. Mostly pictures from Sophie's childhood, some from our early years together. Sophie sat at the kitchen table with it for 2 hours. I stayed in the other room and pretended to read. When she came in, she said, "Mom would have liked Layla, the woman who drove up from Sacramento." I said I thought so too. She said, "I want to call her sometime, if that's okay." I said it seemed okay to me. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I'd found a way to be less of a fact presenter and more of a listener in July. I wish I hadn't had to wait for my daughter to rescue herself, but she did rescue herself, and there is something in that I have to respect. The way she found those emails and didn't fall apart, didn't confront him alone, didn't disappear. She made a plan. She put a note in her bouquet and she handed it to me in front of everyone because she knew I would know what to do with it. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. Helen built her garden the same way she built most things, slowly, with intention, planting things she didn't expect to see bloom for years. I let it go wild every summer because I don't have her patience, but it always comes back. Every October I walk out there and I'm surprised again by what survived. Some things are like that. You tend to them for a long time in the dark, and you don't know what's going to take root until it does. Sophie got engaged again the following spring. A man she'd known since graduate school. Someone steady and plain-spoken who builds custom cabinets in Northeast Portland and asks me nothing about land values. The first time I met him, he spent 45 minutes in the shop, asking me about the drop-leaf table I was finishing. He had good questions. He wasn't performing anything. I told Sophie afterward that I liked him. She said, "I know, I could tell." She was right, she could. The thing about the drop-leaf table in my shop is that I've been working on it, off and on, for about 2 years. The original owners didn't take care of it. The finish was gone. One of the leaves had warped. 2 of the joints were pulling loose. Most people would have thrown it out. I kept thinking it was worth saving if you were patient enough to do it right. I think about Connor sometimes, not with anger, but with the particular exhaustion you feel after something that cost you more than it should have. He was good at reading people. He understood that Sophie's warmth was real, that her trust wasn't naive. It was just unconditional in a way that made her vulnerable. He found that and he used it. That's not a character flaw in Sophie. That's a character flaw in him, and there's a difference worth holding on to. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of it, is that what kept me going through those 7 months wasn't certainty. I was wrong plenty of times about the timing, about how to reach Sophie, about whether she'd ever come around before the wedding. What kept me going was something simpler than certainty. It was just the refusal to look away from what I knew was true. I'd seen the pattern, I had the evidence, and I stayed with it, even when staying with it cost me 3 weeks of silence from my own daughter and a July dinner that ended with her driving away in the dark. That kind of persistence isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like strength when you're inside it. It feels like sitting alone in a workshop at 9 o'clock at night, sanding something that may or may not be worth the effort. You do it anyway. You show up the next morning and do it again. Sophie showed me something I didn't fully expect, though. She found those emails herself. She processed what they meant, alone, over however many sleepless nights that took. And then, instead of falling apart or confronting Connor in private where he could talk his way out of it, she made a plan. She wrote a note. She put it in her bouquet before the ceremony began. She stood at that altar and she handled herself with more composure than most people, twice her age, would have managed. That's not something I taught her directly. I'd like to think I modeled some version of it: the patience to gather your facts before you act, the discipline to not tip your hand too early. But mostly, that was Sophie. That was her own character coming through when it mattered most. Intelligence that she'd built over years of learning to read situations carefully. The kind of moral clarity that knows the difference between what's comfortable and what's right. The cause produced the effect, as it always does. Connor had built his whole approach on the assumption that charm could outrun documentation. It couldn't. It never does, eventually. Dwight told me once that in his experience, the people who get away with things for a long time are usually smarter than everyone around them. They just count on other people being too uncomfortable to look closely. The moment someone decides to actually look, really look, follow the thread, make the call, drive to the diner, the whole thing starts to come apart. Sophie and I don't talk about Connor much anymore. What we talk about is the garden, which she has apparently decided is her project now, and the table in the shop, which she has decided she wants when I'm done with it. She has her mother's way of quietly claiming things she loves. I am still working on the table. It's getting close.